The rain pounded against the windows of Industry's 60-story headquarters as Johnson pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway. At 52, had been working the night shift as a janitor for 8 years, invisible to the wealthy executives who ruled this glass tower during the day. He preferred it that way. The silence, the solitude, and the honest work helped him forget the pain of losing his wife Sarah to cancer 3 years ago. Tonight felt different, though. As mopped the executive floor, he noticed unusual activity. Security guards whispered in corners, their radios crackling with urgent messages. The CEO's office, usually dark by this hour, glowed with harsh fluorescent light. Through the frosted glass, could see shadows moving back and forth in heated discussion. Richard, the billionaire founder of Industries, had built his empire from nothing. Starting with a small construction company 40 years ago, he had grown it into a multinational corporation worth over $50 billion. But Richard was known for more than just his wealth. He was one of the few billionaires who actually cared about his workers, paying fair wages, providing excellent benefits, and treating everyone with respect regardless of their position. Had only spoken to Mr. a few times, but each interaction left him impressed. Unlike other executives who looked through him as if he didn't exist, Richard always nodded and said good evening when their paths crossed. Once, when was cleaning near the conference room, he overheard Richard arguing with board members about increasing worker benefits rather than executive bonuses. "The people who clean our floors and serve our coffee deserve to live with dignity," Richard had said firmly. As worked his way toward the executive wing, he heard raised voices coming from behind the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. He knew he shouldn't listen, but something in the tone made him pause. The voices were angry, threatening even. "You're making a serious mistake, Richard," came the sharp voice of Victoria, the company's chief financial officer. "The Shanghai deal is worth $200 billion. You can't just walk away because of your moral concerns." "Those factories use child labor, Victoria," Richard's voice responded, tired but resolute. "I've seen the reports. Children as young as 12 working 16-hour days. I won't build my company's future on the suffering of innocent kids." Had read about this in the company newsletter. Industries had been negotiating a massive manufacturing deal in China that would double the company's profits. But recent investigations had revealed that their potential partner was using child labor in dangerous conditions. "The other board members have already voted," came another voice that recognized as James, the company's lawyer and longtime board member. 17-1, Richard. Even your own board wants this deal." "Then they can find a new CEO," Richard replied firmly. "I'd rather lose every penny than profit from child exploitation." Heard chairs scraping and footsteps approaching the door. He quickly resumed mopping, but couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As the boardroom door opened, he glimpsed the faces of the executives filing out. Their expressions were cold, calculating. Victoria caught his eye for a moment, and something in her gaze made his blood run cold. Later that night, as finished cleaning the lower floors, he decided to check on Mr.'s office one more time. The hallway was eerily quiet, but light still seeped from under the CEO's door. Knocked gently. "Come in," came Richard's weary voice. Entered to find the billionaire slumped in his chair, looking older than his 65 years. Financial reports and legal documents covered his massive mahogany desk. Richard's usually perfect silver hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit was wrinkled. "Mr. Sir, I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," said quietly. "I know it's not my place, but you look troubled." Richard looked up surprised. In all his years of wealth and power, few people had ever shown genuine concern for his without expecting something in return. "Isn't it?" he asked, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit down." Hesitated. The expensive leather chair probably cost more than he made in 6 months, but something in Richard's manner made him comply. "I'm facing the biggest decision of my life," Richard began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "My entire board wants me to sign a deal that would make us incredibly wealthy, but it would mean supporting companies that exploit children. I built this company to help people, not hurt them." Listened as Richard explained the situation in detail. The Shanghai deal would create thousands of jobs in America and generate massive profits, but it would also support factories where children worked in dangerous conditions for pennies a day. "My wife always said that money without conscience is just paper with pretty pictures," offered quietly. "Sounds like you already know what's right, sir." Richard smiled for the first time that evening. Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, replied. Cancer took her 3 years ago, but her lessons stay with me every day. They talked for another hour about family, values, and the weight of difficult decisions. Shared stories about his late wife's work as a teacher in underprivileged communities, while Richard spoke about his own humble beginnings and his determination to use his wealth responsibly. As prepared to leave, Richard stood and shook his hand firmly. Thank you. Sometimes the clearest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. The next morning brought chaos to Industries. News broke that Richard had suffered a massive heart attack at home and was in critical condition at Metropolitan General Hospital. The stock price plummeted as investors panicked about the future of the company without its visionary leader. Learned about the heart attack when he arrived at work that evening. The entire building buzzed with worry and speculation. Some employees wept openly, while others huddled in groups discussing what this meant for their jobs. But as the days passed, began to notice strange inconsistencies in the official story. The heart attack had supposedly happened at Richard's home, but remembered that the billionaire had mentioned feeling perfectly fine when they spoke. Richard was known for his excellent health, exercising daily and eating carefully after his own father had died young from heart disease. More troubling were the subtle changes happening around the office. Victoria had immediately stepped in as acting CEO, and her first order of business was scheduling an emergency board meeting to reconsider the Shanghai deal. Security had been increased throughout the building, with new guards that didn't recognize patrolling the halls. On the third night after Richard's hospitalization, was cleaning near the executive conference room when he overheard another heated discussion. This time, the voices were celebratory rather than argumentative. The doctors say he's stable but heavily sedated, Victoria was saying. He won't be making any decisions for weeks, maybe months. And if he recovers, James' voice asked. There are ways to ensure his recovery takes a very long time, came a third voice that didn't recognize. My contact at the hospital is very skilled at adjusting medication dosages. Felt his blood freeze. They were talking about keeping Richard drugged and helpless. But why? The answer came in the next few sentences. Once we sign the Shanghai deal without his interference, Industries will be the most profitable company in America, Victoria continued. Richard's moral objections have cost us billions in potential revenue over the years. It's time for new leadership with a clearer vision of success. What about his daughter? Asked. She's been asking questions about visiting her father. She's in London finishing her master's degree, Victoria replied dismissively. She's young, naive, and completely focused on her environmental studies. By the time she realizes what's happening, the deal will be signed and her father will be declared permanently unfit to lead the company due to his health condition. Had heard about? At 25, she was Richard's only child and heir to the family fortune. Unlike many billionaire children, she had chosen to study environmental science rather than business, spending her time working with conservation organizations rather than learning to run the family empire. The conversation in the conference room continued with detailed plans about forging Richard's signature on the Shanghai deal documents and bribing hospital staff to ensure he remained incapacitated. They discussed transferring company assets, changing board structure, and even altering Richard's will to minimize his inheritance. Realized he was witnessing the planning of a corporate coup that involved slowly poisoning one of the few truly good wealthy men in America. His hands shook as he tried to process what he had learned. These people were willing to destroy Richard and steal his company simply because he refused to profit from child labor. As the meeting broke up and the conspirators filed out, made a decision that would change his life forever. He couldn't let this happen. Richard had shown him kindness and respect when no one else in this building ever had. More importantly, the man was fighting for principles that deeply believed in. But who would believe a night janitor's word against some of the most powerful executives in the city? Had no evidence, no recordings, and no connections to anyone who might help. Victoria and her allies controlled the company, the board, and apparently had people inside the hospital where Richard was fighting for his life. Spent the rest of his shift thinking desperately about his options. He considered calling the police, but what crime could he report? Corporate executives meeting in their own building wasn't illegal, and their conversation could be dismissed as speculative planning for legitimate business scenarios. He thought about contacting the media, but again, he had no proof. His word alone wouldn't be enough to convince any journalist to investigate such serious allegations against powerful figures. As dawn approached and his shift ended, made a desperate decision. He needed to find and warn her about what was happening to her father. But tracking down a graduate student in London seemed impossible for someone with his limited resources. Went home to his small apartment and spent the morning searching online for any information about. Most of what he found were old society page photos from charity events and a few academic articles she had co-authored about environmental policy. There was mention of her studies at Cambridge University, but no contact information. He tried calling Cambridge's environmental science department, but the receptionist wouldn't provide any student contact information. He sent emails to several professors listed on the department website, but received only automated replies saying they would respond within several business days. Time was running out. Knew that Victoria was moving quickly to consolidate power and sign the Shanghai deal. Every day that Richard remained helpless in the hospital was another day for the conspirators to strengthen their position. That evening, returned to work with a new determination. If he couldn't reach directly, he would have to find evidence that would force someone to listen to him. He began paying closer attention to the activities on the executive floor, noting which offices had lights on late into the night, and which phone conversations seemed particularly secretive. On his fourth night of careful observation, his patience paid off. While cleaning the offices after midnight, he discovered that Victoria's computer had been left on with several documents open on the screen. His hands, trembling, quickly photographed the screen with his old cell phone. The documents were damning. Email exchanges between Victoria and someone, identified only as Dr. K, discussed extending the patient's recovery period and ensuring cognitive impairment appears permanent. Financial projections showed massive profits from the Shanghai deal, with bonuses allocated to board members who supported the new direction. Most shocking was a document titled Succession Planning that outlined steps for having Richard declared legally incompetent and removing him permanently as CEO. The plan included testimony from bribed doctors about Richard's supposed mental decline and legal filings to transfer his voting shares to a trust controlled by the board. Took photos of everything he could see, but his old phone's camera was blurry and the lighting was poor. Still, it was more evidence than he had before. As he finished photographing the documents, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly closing the files and pretending to empty the trash, tried to look natural as Victoria entered her office. She looked surprised to see him there so late. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded sharply. "Just finishing the cleaning, ma'am," replied, keeping his voice steady. "Sorry if I disturbed anything." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she looked at her computer screen, then back at. "In the future, clean this office earlier in your shift. I don't like people around my workspace when I'm working late." "Yes, ma'am, won't happen again," said, gathering his supplies and heading for the door. As he left, felt Victoria's suspicious gaze following him. He knew he was now in danger. If she suspected he had seen those documents, his life could be at risk. These people had already shown they were willing to poison a billionaire to get what they wanted. A janitor would be much easier to eliminate. Spent the rest of his shift in a state of nervous anxiety, jumping at every sound and constantly checking over his shoulder. When his workday finally ended, he drove home by a circuitous route, checking his mirror for any signs he was being followed. At home, tried to upload the photos from his phone to his computer, but the image quality was too poor to read clearly. The text was blurry, and the lighting had created shadows that obscured important details. His evidence was better than nothing, but still not conclusive enough to convince authorities to act. Frustrated and exhausted, fell asleep at his kitchen table while trying to enhance the photos using his computer's basic editing software. He was awakened hours later by the sound of someone trying to break into his apartment. Crept to his front window and peered through the blinds. Two men in dark suits were examining his door lock while a third stood watch near a black sedan. These weren't ordinary burglars. They looked like professional security or worse. His heart pounding, grabbed his phone and the memory card from his camera. He had to get out immediately. Using his apartment's back exit, he made his way to his car and drove quickly away from his neighborhood. As he drove through the empty early morning streets, realized his worst fears were confirmed. Victoria and her allies knew he had discovered their plan, and they were willing to eliminate him to protect their secret. He was now a marked man with nowhere to turn and evidence that wasn't strong enough to save him. But somewhere in London, Richard's daughter was going about her normal life, completely unaware that her father was being slowly poisoned and his company stolen. Knew he had to find a way to reach her before it was too late for both Richard and himself. The question was how a hunted janitor from Chicago could contact a graduate student in England before the most powerful corporate executives in America silenced him forever. As the sun rose over the city, drove aimlessly through Chicago's streets as dawn broke over the city, his mind racing with desperation and fear. He couldn't go home, couldn't go to work, and couldn't trust anyone he knew. The men in suits had made it clear that Victoria and her allies were serious about silencing him permanently. After an hour of driving, parked at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city, his hands shook as he ordered coffee and tried to think clearly about his impossible situation. He had evidence of a conspiracy, but not enough to convince authorities. He knew Richard was in danger but couldn't prove it, and somewhere in London remained completely unaware that her father's life hung in the balance. Pulled out his phone and began searching desperately for any way to contact. He tried Cambridge University's main number, but at this hour, only an automated system answered. He searched social media platforms, but appeared to maintain very little online presence. Most of the photos he found were from charity events years earlier, with no current contact information. Then remembered something Richard had mentioned during their conversation. Was passionate about environmental conservation and had been working with organizations focused on protecting endangered species. Began searching for recent environmental conferences, research projects, and conservation groups that might have involved a graduate student from Cambridge. After 2 hours of searching, found a breakthrough. A recent article in Environmental Research Quarterly mentioned as a co-author of a study about pollution in developing nations. The article was published just 3 weeks earlier, which meant she was actively involved in current research. Called the journal's editorial office, but was told that they couldn't provide contact information for authors. However, the helpful receptionist mentioned that had attended a conference in Geneva the previous month where she presented findings from her research. This led to the website of the International Environmental Protection Conference. The speakers list included, with her affiliation listed as Cambridge University Environmental Research Lab. More importantly, the site mentioned that she had won an award for her presentation and that there would be a follow-up workshop in London next week. Found the London workshop information and discovered something crucial. The workshop was being held at the Royal Society of Environmental Sciences, and registration was still open. But more importantly, was listed as one of the moderators, which meant she would definitely be there. The workshop was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. Realized this might be his only chance to reach her in person. But how could a janitor from Chicago get to London with no money and men trying to kill him? Spent the next hour calling every discount travel website, looking for the cheapest possible flight to London. The best he could find was a last-minute ticket costing almost $3,000, money he simply didn't have. His janitor's salary barely covered his basic living expenses, and he had no savings left after paying for Sarah's cancer treatments. Desperate, considered options that once would have been unthinkable. He could cash out his small retirement account, but that would take several days to process. He could try to borrow money, but who would lend $3,000 to a janitor with no collateral? He could sell his car, but he needed it to stay mobile while hiding from Victoria's people. As sat in the diner trying to solve an impossible puzzle, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We know where you are. Stop running and this can end peacefully." His blood ran cold. Somehow they had tracked his phone. He quickly removed the battery and dropped the device in a trash can outside the diner. Now he was completely cut off from communication, but at least he couldn't be tracked electronically. Walking to a nearby bus station, used to call the one person he thought might help. His brother lived in Detroit and worked as a mechanic. They hadn't spoken in months, but was the only family had left. "Man, what's wrong? You sound terrible," said when he heard his brother's voice. explained everything as quickly as possible. The conversation with Richard, the overheard conspiracy, the evidence he had discovered, and the men who were now hunting him. "This sounds crazy," brother replied. "You're talking about billionaires and corporate conspiracies. Maybe you should just go to the police." "They won't believe me, and these people have connections everywhere. I need to get to London to warn Richard's daughter before they kill him." "London, you're talking about thousands of dollars. I don't have that kind of money." "I know it's a lot to ask," said desperately. "But a good man is going to die because of his principles. He refused to profit from child labor, and now they're poisoning him for it." Was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "Remember when Sarah got sick and you needed money for experimental treatment? I wanted to help but couldn't afford it." "That's different. That was family." "No, it's not different. You're asking me to help you save someone who stands up for what's right. Sarah would have wanted us to help someone like that." Agreed to wire $2,000, everything he had in savings. It wasn't enough for a flight, but it was a start. Would have to find another way to make up the difference. Took a bus to a different part of the city and found an internet where he could plan his next moves without being traced. He discovered that cargo ships occasionally took paying passengers across the Atlantic, but the journey took over a week. By then, it would be too late. Then found something unexpected. A group called Environmental Justice Network was organizing a charter flight to London for activists attending the same workshop where would be speaking. The flight was leaving tomorrow night, and they had a few remaining seats available at a reduced rate for students and low-income activists. The cost was $1,500, which could barely afford with money and his own small emergency fund. But the application required proof of environmental activism or academic affiliation, neither of which possessed. Desperate, crafted a story about being a community organizer working on environmental justice issues in low-income neighborhoods. He claimed to have extensive experience helping working-class families deal with pollution and industrial contamination. While not technically true, it wasn't entirely false either. Had grown up in a neighborhood plagued by factory pollution, and he had seen firsthand how environmental problems affected poor communities. Submitted his application along with payment, praying that they wouldn't verify his credentials too carefully. Within 2 hours, he received an email confirmation. His seat on the charter flight was confirmed, departing Chicago tomorrow at 8 p.m. and arriving in London early Thursday morning. Now faced a new challenge, surviving until tomorrow night without being caught by Victoria's people. He couldn't go home, couldn't use his credit cards, and couldn't stay in one place too long. With less than 24 hours until his flight, needed to stay hidden while also preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his life. Spent the night in a cheap motel on the far side of the city, paying cash and using a fake name. He barely slept, jumping at every sound in the hallway. When morning came, he walked to a nearby shopping center and used cash to buy a prepaid phone. With his new phone, tried one more time to reach directly. He called Cambridge University and asked to speak with someone in the environmental research lab. After being transferred several times, he reached a graduate student who knew. "She's actually traveling this week," the student said. "She's in London for some big environmental conference. Is this urgent?" "Very urgent," replied. "It's about her father. There's something she needs to know immediately." "I can try to get a message to her, but she's incredibly busy with the conference preparations. What should I tell her?" Realized he couldn't explain the entire situation to a stranger over the phone. "Please tell her that someone who worked with her father has important information about his health condition. Ask her to call this number as soon as possible." Left his new phone number and prayed that would call before his flight departed. He spent the day moving between different public locations, never staying anywhere long enough to be tracked down. As evening approached, made his way to the airport. The charter flight was leaving from a private terminal used by corporate and humanitarian flights. When he arrived, was surprised to find himself surrounded by idealistic young activists and academics, all passionate about environmental protection. Dr. Martinez, the group's organizer, welcomed warmly. "We're so glad you could join us," she said. "Your work in environmental justice sounds fascinating. The workshop in London will be perfect for networking with like-minded people." Felt guilty about deceiving these genuine activists, but reminded himself that he was ultimately fighting for the same principles they believed in. Richard's refusal to profit from child labor was exactly the kind of ethical environmental stance that these people would support. During the 8-hour flight to London, sat next to a young woman named who was studying industrial pollution's impact on minority communities. As she talked passionately about her research, realized that his cover story was actually more accurate than he had thought. His years as a janitor had shown him how environmental problems disproportionately affected working-class people like himself. The worst part is how companies target poor neighborhoods for their polluting factories, said. They know that wealthy communities have the political power to fight back, so they exploit areas where people are struggling just to survive. Nodded, thinking about Richard's refusal to support factories that exploited children. Some business leaders actually care about doing the right thing, he said, but it seems like they're becoming rare. That's exactly why we need more people like you fighting at the community level, replied. Real change happens when working people stand up and demand better. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, thought about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A week ago, he was simply a janitor trying to live quietly and honor his wife's memory. Now he was flying to London to save a billionaire's life and protect a company built on principles of fairness and justice. When the plane landed at airport, felt both excitement and terror. He was finally in the same city as, but he still had no guarantee that he could reach her in time. The environmental workshop didn't begin until tomorrow afternoon, and he had no idea where was staying or how to contact her before then. Took the underground into central London, overwhelmed by the size and complexity of the city. He had never traveled outside the United States before, and everything from the accents to the currency felt foreign and intimidating. Using his limited funds, found a small hostel near the Royal Society of Environmental Sciences where the workshop would take place. He spent his first night in London lying awake, rehearsing what he would say to when he finally met her. The next morning's prepaid phone finally rang. His heart jumped as he answered. "Is this the person who called about my father?" asked a young woman with a refined English accent. "Miss, thank God you called. My name is Johnson. I work at your father's company and he's in terrible danger." "I know about his heart attack," replied. "I've been trying to get back to Chicago, but the doctors say he's stable and that travel arrangements are being handled by company executives." "Miss, please listen to me carefully. Your father didn't have a natural heart attack. People inside his own company are poisoning him to steal control of industries." There was silence on the other end of the phone. Could almost hear processing this shocking information. "That's a very serious accusation," she said finally. "Who are you exactly and why should I believe you?" Spent the next 10 minutes explaining everything he had witnessed and discovered. He told about the boardroom conversations, the documents he had photographed, and the men who had tried to break into his apartment. "I have some evidence," said, "but it's not clear enough to convince the police. They're moving fast to sign a business deal your father refused because it involved child labor. Every day he stays unconscious is another day they get stronger." "Where are you now?" asked. "London. I flew here to find you because I couldn't reach you any other way." "You flew from Chicago to London to warn me about my father." "Your father is one of the few truly good, wealthy people I've ever met," replied. "He treated me with respect when no one else did. More importantly, he's fighting for principles that matter. Children shouldn't suffer so that corporations can make bigger profits." Was quiet again. Could tell she was struggling to decide whether to believe his incredible story. "I'm supposed to moderate a panel at an environmental conference this afternoon," she said finally. "Can you meet me there? I want to see this evidence you mentioned and hear more details about what you witnessed." Felt a wave of relief. Finally, after days of running and hiding, he was going to have a chance to tell someone who could actually help Richard. "I'll be there," said. "But miss, please be careful. These people have already tried to kill me. If they know you're asking questions, you could be in danger too." "I understand," replied. "Meet me at the Royal Society building at 3 o'clock. Ask for the Environmental Justice Workshop registration desk." As hung up the phone, he realized that the most difficult part of his mission was just beginning. He had found, but now he had to convince her to risk everything to save her father's life and company. Outside his hostel window, London bustled with activity under gray autumn skies. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Richard lay unconscious in a hospital bed, while his enemies consolidated their power and planned his permanent removal from the company he had built on principles of fairness and justice. Arrived at the Royal Society of Environmental Sciences building an hour early, his nerves making it impossible to wait any longer at the hostel. The imposing Victorian architecture intimidated him as he approached the grand entrance, where well-dressed academics and activists streamed in and out, carrying laptops and research papers. Inside, the building buzzed with intellectual energy. Conference attendees clustered in small groups, discussing climate policy, corporate responsibility, and environmental justice. Felt completely out of place among these educated, passionate people who spoke confidently about complex topics that he barely understood. The registration desk was easy to find, staffed by enthusiastic volunteers wearing green conference badges. Approached nervously, unsure how to explain his presence without revealing too much. "I'm here to meet," he told a young volunteer. "She's expecting me." "Oh, you must be here for the environmental justice workshop," the volunteer replied cheerfully. "It's one of our star presenters today. She should be here soon for the 3 o'clock panel." Found a quiet corner where he could watch the entrance while staying relatively hidden. He pulled out his phone and reviewed the blurry photos he had taken of Victoria's computer screen. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but combined with his eyewitness account of the conversations, it might be enough to convince that her father was in real danger. At exactly 3 o'clock, spotted a young woman with long dark hair entering the main conference room. Even from a distance, her resemblance to Richard was unmistakable. She had the same intelligent eyes and determined posture that remembered from his conversations with her father. Was 25 years old, but carried herself with a confidence that suggested maturity beyond her years. She wore simple dark jeans and a forest green sweater, deliberately understated compared to the expensive clothes she could afford. Had read that she intentionally avoided flaunting her family's wealth, preferring to be judged on her own merits as a researcher and activist. Waited until finished greeting colleagues and setting up for her panel presentation before approaching her. When their eyes met across the room, he could see wariness mixed with curiosity in her expression. "Miss," said quietly as he approached, "I'm Johnson. We spoke on the phone this morning." Studied him carefully. Was acutely aware of how he must appear to her. A middle-aged black man in worn clothes, claiming to have evidence of a conspiracy against one of America's most powerful billionaires. He wouldn't blame her for being skeptical. "Mr. Johnson," said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming so far to speak with me. I have about 30 minutes before my panel starts. Should we find somewhere private to talk?" Led to a small conference room away from the main crowd. As soon as they were alone, her composed demeanor shifted to reveal deep concern and worry. "Tell me exactly what you saw and heard," she said without preamble. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Spent the next 20 minutes recounting everything in detail. He described his conversation with Richard about the Shanghai deal, the boardroom meeting where executives celebrated Richard's incapacitation, and the documents he had photographed that outlined plans for permanently removing Richard from power. "You said my father looked fine when you spoke with him the night before his heart attack," said, leaning forward intently. "He didn't mention any chest pain or breathing difficulties." "Nothing like that," replied. "He was tired and stressed about the board meeting, but physically he seemed completely healthy. He even mentioned that he'd been working out extra hard that week to deal with the pressure." His expression grew darker. "That doesn't match what the doctors told the family. They said he'd been showing signs of cardiac stress for weeks." Showed the blurry photos on his phone. While the text was difficult to read, she could make out enough to see email exchanges about extending recovery time and ensuring cognitive impairment. "These photos aren't clear enough to use as legal evidence," said, studying the images intently. "But combined with what you witnessed, they paint a terrifying picture." "Miss, I know this sounds unbelievable," said earnestly. "I'm just a janitor, and these are some of the most powerful people in America. But I've worked in that building for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what's happening now." Was quiet for several moments, clearly wrestling with the implications of story. "If what you're saying is true, my father is being murdered slowly while his own company is stolen from under him. But how do we prove it? How do we stop it?" "I was hoping you might have ideas about that," admitted. I've done everything I can think of. The police won't listen to me, and I don't have enough evidence to convince journalists. What about other employees at the company? Asked. Surely someone else must have noticed something suspicious. Shook his head. The executives are being very careful. Most employees just know that Mr. had a heart attack and is recovering. Victoria has been playing the part of a concerned acting CEO, making all the right statements about hopping for his recovery. Victoria repeated, her voice carrying new anger. I never trusted her. She was always pushing my father to prioritize profits over principles. Began packing the small room, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. We need to get back to Chicago immediately, she said finally. I need to see my father and talk to his doctors directly. Miss, that might be exactly what they're expecting, warned. If Victoria and her people know you're asking questions, they might try to hurt you too. They're already hurting my father, replied firmly. I can't just sit here in London while he's being poisoned. Admired her courage, but worried about her safety. These people tried to break into my apartment. They have professional security people working for them. You'd be walking into a trap. Then we need to be smarter than they are, said. My father built his company by outthinking his competitors, not by avoiding confrontation. A knock on the conference room door interrupted their conversation. One of the workshop volunteers peered in apologetically. Your panel is starting in 5 minutes, the volunteer said. The other moderators are looking for you. Looked torn between her commitment to the conference and her need to help her father. Could see the conflict playing out across her face. Go to your panel, said quietly. Your father would want you to honor your commitments. We can continue planning afterward. Are you sure? Asked. This conference seems trivial compared to what's happening to him. It's not trivial, replied. You're fighting for the same principles your father believes in. Environmental protection and corporate responsibility are connected to everything else. Smiled gratefully. Will you stay and watch the panel? I'd like to continue our conversation as soon as it's finished. Nodded, and they returned to the main conference room together. Az took her place at the front of the room with 3 other panelists, found a seat in the back where he could observe while staying relatively inconspicuous. The panel discussion focused on corporate environmental responsibility in developing nations. Az listened to speak passionately about companies that prioritize profits over environmental and human welfare. He realized that her fight was intimately connected to her father's struggle against the Shanghai deal. Too many corporations see developing countries as places where they can ignore the environmental and labor standards they're required to follow at home, said during her opening remarks. They exploit regulatory weaknesses to maximize profits while causing tremendous harm to local communities. Another panelist, a professor from Oxford, added, the race to the bottom in terms of environmental and labor standards hurts everyone except corporate shareholders. Companies that refuse to participate in this exploitation should be celebrated, not punished by their boards. Felt a chill as he listened to this discussion. The panelists were describing exactly the situation that Richard faced with the Shanghai deal. He was being punished by his own board for refusing to profit from child labor and environmental destruction. During the question and answer period, an audience member asked about strategies for supporting business leaders who tried to maintain ethical standards in competitive industries. The sad reality is that ethical business leaders often face tremendous pressure from shareholders and board members who prioritize short-term profits, responded. Sometimes these leaders need support from outside their companies to resist that pressure. Saw a glance in his direction as she answered. She was sending him a message that she understood the connection between her environmental work and her father's situation. After the panel ended, was surrounded by colleagues and admirers wanting to discuss her presentation. Waited patiently while she graciously answered questions and exchanged contact information with other researchers. When the crowd finally dispersed, rejoined in the small conference room. Her energy from the panel discussion had given way to renewed determination about her father's situation. I've been thinking about our conversation while I was speaking, she said. We need more evidence before we can act effectively, but we also can't wait too long or it will be too late to save him. What do you have in mind? Asked. I'm going to call the hospital directly and demand to speak with my father's primary physician, said. As his daughter, I have a right to detailed information about his treatment. Will that work? Won't they just tell you what Victoria wants them to say? Maybe, but doctors have professional obligations that go beyond corporate pressure. If I ask the right questions, I might be able to detect whether something suspicious is happening. Pulled out her phone and found the number for Metropolitan General Hospital. After being transferred several times, she reached Dr. Williams, the cardiologist treating Richard. Listened tensely as questioned the doctor about her father's condition, treatment plan, and prognosis. His tone was polite but persistent, clearly drawing on her academic training to ask detailed, informed questions. Dr. Williams, I'm concerned about the length of my father's recovery time, said. His previous medical records show excellent cardiovascular health. Are you certain this was a natural cardiac event? Could hear the doctor's defensive tone, even from across the room. Dr. Williams insisted that Richard's condition was consistent with stress-induced cardiac episodes in men his age, but she seemed uncomfortable with some of specific questions. I'd like to review his complete medical records and speak with his previous cardiologist, continued. Can you arrange for those files to be sent to me? There was a long pause before Dr. Williams responded. I'll need to check with hospital administration about releasing those records. There may be privacy concerns. Privacy concerns? His voice sharpened. I'm his daughter and listed as his medical emergency contact. Since when do I need permission to review my incapacitated father's medical records? After ending the call, turned to with a grim expression. Something is definitely wrong. Dr. Williams was evasive about basic questions regarding his treatment. She also seemed surprised that I was calling from London, which suggests that someone told her I wouldn't be involved in his care. Victoria probably told the hospital staff that you were too far away to be consulted about medical decisions, suggested. Exactly, which means they've been making treatment decisions without consulting his only family member. His anger was now clearly visible. That's not just unethical, it's probably illegal. Felt encouraged by his growing conviction, but remained worried about the danger they both faced. Miss, we need to be very careful about our next steps. If Victoria and her allies realize we're investigating, they might accelerate their timeline. You're right, agreed. We need a plan that protects my father while gathering evidence that can't be dismissed or covered up. They spent the next hour developing a strategy. Would return to Chicago immediately, but instead of confronting Victoria directly, she would work through legal channels to gain access to her father's medical records and demand an independent medical evaluation. Meanwhile, would return to his job and try to gather more evidence of the conspiracy. This time, he would be more careful about documentation, using better equipment and finding ways to record conversations rather than relying on blurry photographs. I can get you a small recording device, offered, something that won't be detected by standard security sweeps. Won't that be dangerous for both of us? Asked. If they find it on me, they'll know we're working together. The alternative is letting them slowly murder my father and steal his company, replied grimly. Some risks are worth taking. As they prepared to leave the conference center, grasped his hand firmly. Mr. Johnson, I can't thank you enough for what you're doing. You've already risked your life to warn me about this conspiracy. Your father is a good man, replied simply. In a world where most wealthy people only care about getting richer, he actually tries to use his power to help others. People like that are worth protecting. When this is over, I want you to know that you'll always have a place at Industries, said. Not as a janitor, but in whatever capacity you choose. My father and I won't forget what you've done. Felt touched by her offer, but remained focused on the immediate crisis. Let's just concentrate on saving his life first. Everything else can wait. They exchanged contact information and agreed to communicate every 12 hours while implementing their plan. Would fly back to Chicago the next morning, while would take the same charter flight back with the environmental group. As walked back to his hostel through the London evening, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken over the past week. A routine conversation with a billionaire CEO had led him across the Atlantic Ocean and into the middle of a corporate conspiracy that could determine the fate of thousands of workers and the future of ethical business practices. But also thought about his late wife, Sarah, who had always believed that ordinary people had the power to make a difference when they stood up for what was right. She would have been proud to see him fighting to protect someone who refused to profit from child labor, even at great personal risk. The next morning, boarded the charter flight back to Chicago with the same group of environmental activists he had met on the way to London. This time, however, he felt like less of an. His conversation with had helped him understand that his struggle to save Richard was directly connected to the broader fight for environmental and social justice. During the flight, sat again with the young researcher studying industrial pollution. As she continued sharing her findings about corporate environmental crimes, realized that companies like the ones involved in the Shanghai deal were exactly the kind that was fighting against. The worst part is how these companies exploit both workers and the environment simultaneously, said. They set up factories in countries with weak regulations, then pollute the air and water while paying workers starvation wages. What if there was a major American corporation that refused to be part of that system? Asked. Would that make a difference? Absolutely, replied enthusiastically. When large corporations take ethical stances, it creates pressure on competitors to improve their practices. But unfortunately, most business leaders care more about quarterly profits than long-term sustainability. Nodded, thinking about Richard's lonely stand against the Shanghai deal. If Richard could be saved and retain control of his company, it might inspire other business leaders to prioritize principles over profits. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, felt both hope and terror about what lay ahead. Would already be in the air, flying toward a confrontation that could save her father's life or result in both of their deaths. Within hours, would return to the same building where powerful executives were slowly murdering a man whose only crime was refusing to exploit children for profit. This time, however, wouldn't be facing return to Chicago with a mixture of determination and fear coursing through his veins. The charter flight had landed at dawn, giving him just enough time to return to his apartment and assess whether it was safe to retrieve some belongings. As he approached his building, noticed that the black sedan was no longer parked outside, but he remained cautious. Using a back entrance he had discovered during his years living there, slipped into his apartment. Everything appeared normal, but he could tell someone had been inside. Drawers had been opened and closed, papers had been moved slightly, and his computer showed signs of being accessed. Victoria's people had searched his home thoroughly, but had been careful not to leave obvious evidence of their intrusion. Quickly gathered essential items, clean work clothes, his employee ID badge, and a few personal mementos of Sarah that he couldn't bear to leave behind. He also retrieved a small digital recorder that Sarah had used for recording her thoughts during her cancer treatment. It wasn't sophisticated equipment, but it might be good enough to capture conversations if he could get close enough to the conspirators. Before leaving his apartment, called on his prepaid phone. She had landed in Chicago 2 hours earlier and was already implementing their plan. I'm at the hospital now, said quietly. I demanded to see my father immediately and they couldn't refuse, but Mr. Johnson, what I'm seeing is worse than we thought. What do you mean? Asked, feeling his heart sink. He's completely unconscious, not just sedated for recovery. The nurses keep talking about how unusual his case is, how most cardiac patients are awake and responsive by this point. And there's a private nurse who never leaves his room, someone I don't recognize from previous visits. Felt his anger rising. That must be how they're controlling his medication. They have someone there constantly to make sure he gets whatever drugs they're using to keep him unconscious. I'm going to demand a second opinion from an independent cardiologist, said. But I need to be careful. If they realize I'm suspicious, they might move him to a different facility where I can't access him at all. Miss, please be careful. These people have already shown they're willing to kill to get what they want. I understand the risks, replied firmly, but I can't just let them murder my father slowly while pretending it's natural recovery. They agreed to meet later that evening to compare notes and plan their next moves. Would continue working through official channels at the hospital, while would return to his job and try to gather more evidence of the corporate conspiracy. Spent the day at a public library, staying off the streets until his evening shift began. As closing time approached at Industries, he made his way to the building with tremendous apprehension. He had no way of knowing whether Victoria and her allies suspected his involvement in their exposed plans. The security guards at the main entrance greeted normally, showing no signs of unusual suspicion. badged into the building and collected his cleaning cart from the janitorial supply room, trying to maintain his typical routine while remaining alert for any signs of danger. As began his cleaning rounds on the lower floors, he noticed increased security throughout the building. Additional guards patrolled the hallways, and several offices that were normally empty during night hours showed lights and activity. Something significant was happening at Industries. Made his way carefully toward the executive floors, listening for conversations and watching for opportunities to learn more about the conspirators' current plans. As he cleaned near the elevator bank, he overheard two security guards discussing increased protection measures. "They want extra coverage on all the executive floors tonight," one guard said to another. "Some kind of important board meeting happening after hours." "Must be about the situation," the second guard replied. "Word is they're finalizing some major business deal while the old man recovers." Felt his pulse quicken. The emergency board meeting could only mean one thing. Victoria and her allies were moving to formalize their control over the company and sign the Shanghai deal. They were probably planning to vote Richard permanently out of his CEO position while he remained incapacitated. As cleaned his way toward the executive conference room, he could hear the murmur of multiple voices engaged in heated discussion. He positioned his cart near the door and activated Sarah's old recorder, hopping to capture evidence of what was being planned. The conference room door was slightly ajar, allowing to hear fragments of the conversation inside. Victoria's voice dominated the discussion, outlining legal strategies for transferring Richard's voting rights and CEO authority to the board of directors. The medical reports from Dr. Williams confirm that Richard's cognitive function has been severely impaired by his cardiac event, Victoria was saying. "We have legal grounds to declare him unfit to continue as CEO." James' voice responded. "The succession plan is already in place. As acting CEO, you'll have full authority to sign the Shanghai deal and restructure the company's operations." "What about?" asked another voice that recognized as board member Charles Bradford. "She's been asking uncomfortable questions at the hospital." "Is young and naive," Victoria replied dismissively. "She's focused on environmental issues, not business operations. By the time she understands what's happening, the transition will be complete." Adjusted his position to hear better, accidentally bumping his cart against the wall. The conversation inside the conference room stopped abruptly. "What was that noise?" Victoria's sharp voice demanded. Quickly resumed cleaning, making normal janitorial sounds as footsteps approached the door. James emerged from the conference room and looked directly at. "You're working late tonight," said suspiciously. "Yes, sir," replied, keeping his voice steady. "Extra cleaning needed after the daytime meetings." Studied carefully for several long moments before returning to the conference room. Could hear whispered conversation, but couldn't make out the words. He quickly moved his cart away from the door and continued cleaning down the hallway. 20 minutes later, the conference room door opened, and the board members began filing out. Kept his head down, focusing on his cleaning while listening to their departing conversations. "The vote is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m., Victoria said to the group. "Make sure all documentation is ready for filing with the State Corporate Commission." "And the Shanghai contracts?" Charles Bradford asked. "Will be signed immediately after the board vote," Victoria confirmed. "Our Chinese partners are eager to finalize the arrangement." As the executives departed, felt a combination of triumph and terror. He had recorded evidence of their plan to illegally remove Richard from power and sign the controversial deal. But he had also been noticed by, which meant his cover might be blown. Finished his cleaning rounds as quickly as possible and left the building. As soon as he was safely away, he called to share what he had learned. "They're voting tomorrow morning to remove your father as CEO," reported. "Then they're signing the Shanghai deal immediately afterward." "That gives us less than 12 hours, said grimly. "Did you get recordings of their conversation?" "Some of it, but I'm not sure how clear the audio will be. Miss, I think they might suspect I was listening. One of the board members seemed very suspicious when he saw me." "Then we need to act tonight," decided. "I've been reviewing my father's medical records, and I found something important. The medications he's receiving aren't standard cardiac recovery drugs. Some of them are experimental sedatives that could cause permanent brain damage if used long-term." Felt sick. They're not just keeping him unconscious. They're trying to make him permanently unable to challenge their takeover. Exactly, but I have an idea for exposing everything. My father's personal lawyer, David, has been trying to reach him about urgent business matters. David doesn't know about the conspiracy, but he's been frustrated by the company's refusal to let him speak with his client. Can we trust him? Asked. David has been my father's lawyer and friend for 20 years. He wrote my father's will and knows all his wishes about the company. If we can show him evidence of what's happening, he'll have the legal authority to challenge the board's actions. They agreed to meet David at his office that night. Would bring the medical evidence showing her father was being inappropriately sedated, while would provide his recordings of the conspirators' conversations. David's law office was located in downtown Chicago, in a prestigious building that served many of the city's wealthy families. When arrived at 11 p.m., he found waiting in the lobby with a distinguished Indian man in his 50s. "Mr. Johnson, this is David," said. "David, this is the man who risked his life to warn me about what's happening to my father." David shook his hand firmly. "Miss has told me an incredible story about corporate conspiracy and medical malpractice. I need to hear your account directly and review whatever evidence you've gathered." In David's office, surrounded by law books and framed degrees, recounted everything he had witnessed over the past week. David listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details or requesting to repeat certain conversations. When played the recording from that evening's board meeting, David's expression grew increasingly serious. Despite the muffled audio quality, Victoria's voice was clearly audible discussing plans to declare Richard unfit and transfer his authority to herself. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud at minimum," David said after hearing the recording. "Possibly attempted murder if they're intentionally using drugs to cause brain damage." Shared the medical records she had obtained, pointing out the unusual medications that weren't typically used for cardiac recovery. David studied the documents carefully, comparing them to medical reports from Richard's previous health checkups. "Your father has always been in excellent health," David confirmed. "These medications would never be prescribed for someone recovering from a natural heart attack. They're designed to keep patients in deep sedation for extended periods." "Can we stop tomorrow's board vote?" asked urgently. David considered the question carefully. "We can file an emergency injunction, but we need more evidence to convince a judge. Corporate board votes are usually protected by business judgment rules, unless we can prove criminal activity." "What kind of evidence do you need?" asked. "Medical testimony showing that Richard is being deliberately kept unconscious, or direct evidence that the board conspired to cause his incapacitation in the first place." And looked at each other, both realizing the same thing. They needed to get inside Metropolitan General Hospital and document what was being done to Richard. "The private nurse who stays with my father," said slowly. "If she's part of the conspiracy, she might have instructions or medications that prove what they're doing." "That would be dangerous," David warned. "If you're caught searching a hospital room, you could be arrested, and if these people are as ruthless as you believe, you could be putting yourselves in physical danger." "My father is already in danger," replied. "Every hour we wait is another hour they're damaging his brain. We have to take the risk." David spent the next hour helping them plan a strategy for gathering evidence at the hospital. As Richard's daughter, had legitimate access to his room during visiting hours. If she could somehow document the inappropriate medications or record the private nurse admitting to the conspiracy, they would have the evidence needed for an emergency legal injunction. "I'll prepare injunction papers tonight," David promised. "If you can get solid evidence by morning, I'll file them immediately to stop the board vote." As they prepared to leave David's office, felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow would determine whether Richard lived or died, whether his company remained committed to ethical principles, and whether justice could prevail against powerful corporate interests. "Miss," said as they walked toward the parking garage, "are you sure you want to do this? Once we start gathering evidence at the hospital, there's no going back. If Victoria and her people realize what we're doing, they might try to eliminate all of us." Turned to face, her expression resolute. "Mr. Johnson, you left your entire life behind to warn me about this conspiracy. You flew across an ocean to save a man you barely knew because you believed it was the right thing to do. How could I do any less for my own father?" Nodded, feeling a surge of admiration for courage. Despite her youth and privilege, she possessed the same moral backbone that had driven Richard to reject the Shanghai deal. "Then let's go save your father," said simply, as they drove through Chicago's empty streets toward Metropolitan General Hospital. Both understood that they were about to attempt something that could either expose a deadly conspiracy or result in their own destruction. But they also knew that some fights were worth any risk, and protecting someone who stood up for children's welfare was exactly that kind of fight. The hospital loomed ahead of them in the darkness, its windows glowing with the lights of round-the-clock medical care. Somewhere inside those walls, Richard lay unconscious while people he had trusted slowly poisoned him for the crime of maintaining his principles. Within hours, and would either have the evidence needed to save Richard's life and company, or they would join him as victims of a conspiracy driven by greed and corporate ambition. The next few hours would determine whether good people could still triumph over corruption, or whether money and power had finally become too. The Metropolitan General Hospital stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the Chicago skyline, its emergency lights casting an eerie glow across the empty parking lot. And sat in her rental car, watching the building's late-night rhythm through the windows of the cardiac intensive care unit on the 7th floor. There, pointed to a window where a figure moved back and forth. "That's my father's room. The private nurse has been there every time I've visited. She never leaves, not even for breaks." Studied the building's layout, nodding security cameras and the positions of hospital staff visible through various windows. "How do we get close enough to gather evidence without arousing suspicion?" "Visiting hours ended 3 hours ago, but family members are allowed to see critical patients at any time," explained. "The problem is the private nurse. If she's part of the conspiracy, she'll be watching for anything unusual." They had spent the drive to the hospital refining their plan. Would enter as a concerned daughter making a late-night visit to check on her father's condition. Meanwhile, would find a way to observe the private nurse's activities and potentially overhear conversations about Richard's treatment. "I brought something that might help," said, pulling a small device from her purse. "It's a wireless camera about the size of a button. If I can attach it somewhere in the room, we might be able to record whatever happens when I'm not there." Marveled at its preparation. Despite her youth and academic background, she was approaching this mission with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. "Where did you get surveillance equipment?" "I have friends from my environmental activism work who monitor corporate pollution illegally," replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes fighting for the environment requires bending a few rules." At 2 a.m., they decided to make their move. The hospital would be quieter during the early morning hours, with minimal staff and fewer potential witnesses to their activities. Entered through the main entrance while found a service door near the loading docks. His years of working in large buildings had taught him that maintenance areas were often less closely monitored than public spaces. Made his way to the 7th floor using a service elevator, carrying a small toolbox he had brought to help him blend in as a maintenance worker. The cardiac intensive care unit was dimly lit, with only a few nurses visible at the central station. Richard's room was at the end of a long corridor, isolated from other patients. As approached carefully, he could see the private nurse through the partially open door. She was a thin woman with gray hair, wearing scrubs that looked more expensive than typical hospital uniforms. Found a utility closet across the hall where he could observe while appearing to perform routine maintenance. Through the crack in the door, he watched as arrived at her father's room. "Excuse me," said to the private nurse. "I'm Richard's daughter. I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep. May I sit with him for a while?" The nurse looked surprised and slightly annoyed by the interruption. "Of course, miss. I'm nurse. I've been providing special care for your father since his admission." Could hear their conversation clearly from his position. He activated Sarah's recorder and listened as questioned the nurse about Richard's treatment and prognosis. "He seems so deeply unconscious," said with genuine concern. "Is this normal for cardiac patients at this stage of recovery?" Nurse response was carefully rehearsed. "Every patient responds differently to cardiac stress. Your father's case is more severe than most, requiring extended sedation to prevent additional strain on his heart." What medications is he receiving? Pressed. I have some medical background from my research work. Noticed the nurse hesitate before answering. The standard cardiac recovery protocol, plus some specialized medications to manage his specific symptoms. Moved closer to her father's bedside, positioning herself where she could see the IV lines and medication labels. He looks so pale. Are you sure his brain is getting adequate oxygen? Miss, I assure you that your father is receiving excellent care, nurse said firmly. Dr. Williams has designed his treatment plan very carefully. As continued asking questions, saw her discreetly attach the tiny camera to the underside of a small shelf near Richard's bed. The device was virtually invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. I'd like to speak with Dr. Williams about my father's long-term prognosis, said. When will she be available? Dr. Williams makes her rounds early in the morning, the nurse replied. But I should mention that your father's care is being coordinated through the company's executive team. They've requested that all medical updates go through them first. Felt his anger rising. Even the medical staff had been instructed to prevent from getting direct information about her father's condition. That seems unusual, said carefully. I'm his next of kin. Don't I have the right to speak directly with his doctors? Nurse looked uncomfortable but maintained her position. I'm just following the protocols that have been established. Perhaps you should speak with the hospital administration tomorrow. Spent another 20 minutes with her father, holding his hand and speaking to him softly. Could see that she was struggling to maintain her composure while looking at Richard's unconscious form. When finally left the room, waited several minutes before making his own move. Using his maintenance worker disguise, he approached nurse station with a clipboard and official-looking work order. Excuse me, ma'am, said politely. I need to check the oxygen monitoring system in this room. Hospital maintenance called about a possible sensor malfunction. Nurse looked suspicious. No one told me about any maintenance work scheduled for tonight. It's an emergency call, replied, showing her the fake work order he had prepared. Problems with oxygen sensors can't wait until morning, especially for critical patients. After some hesitation, nurse allowed to enter the room while she watched from the doorway. Pretended to examine medical equipment while actually photographing medication labels and IV bag contents. As he worked, overheard nurse making a quiet phone call. Yes, the daughter was here asking questions about medications, she said. She seemed more knowledgeable than expected. Strained to hear the other side of the conversation, but could only make out the nurse's responses. I understand, nurse continued. I'll increase the sedative dosage as discussed. The patient won't be waking up anytime soon. Felt his blood run cold. He had just heard direct confirmation that Richard was being deliberately kept unconscious with unnecessary sedatives. The private nurse was definitely part of the conspiracy. As finished his pretended maintenance work, he noticed something else disturbing. Hidden behind the standard medical equipment was a small infusion pump that wasn't connected to any of the main IV lines. This device appeared to be delivering additional medication directly into Richard's bloodstream. Photographed the hidden pump and its medication label, which showed a drug he didn't recognize. Based on nurse's phone conversation, this was likely the experimental sedative that had mentioned could cause permanent brain damage. When completed his maintenance work and left the room, he felt both triumph and urgency. They now had evidence of the medical conspiracy, but Richard's condition was deteriorating with every hour that passed. Made his way back to the service elevator and left the hospital through the same loading dock entrance he had used earlier. Was waiting in the parking lot, anxiously watching for his return. Did you get anything? She asked immediately as got into the car. More than we hoped for, replied, showing her the photographs of the hidden infusion pump and medication labels. I also heard the nurse talking on the phone about increasing your father's sedative dosage. Studied the photos on his phone, her face growing pale with anger. This medication isn't used for cardiac patients at all. It's a powerful anesthetic agent that can cause brain damage if used for extended periods. We need to get this evidence to David immediately, said. The board vote is in less than 6 hours. They drove quickly back to David's office, where the lawyer was waiting with completed injunction papers. When David saw photographs and heard about the nurse's phone conversation, His expression became grimly determined. "This is attempted murder," David said flatly. "We have enough evidence to not only stop the board vote, but to have everyone involved arrested for conspiracy." David immediately began making phone calls to judges he knew, seeking an emergency hearing to issue restraining orders against the board members. Meanwhile, used the wireless camera feed to monitor her father's room from David's office. At 4 a.m., the camera showed Nurse adjusting the hidden infusion pump and increasing the flow rate of the experimental sedative. They were literally watching Richard being slowly poisoned in real time. "We can't wait for legal proceedings," said desperately. "If they increase that dosage much more, the brain damage could become irreversible." David managed to reach Judge Foster, who agreed to an emergency hearing at 6 a.m. But that still left 2 hours during which Richard's condition could deteriorate beyond recovery. "I'm going back to the hospital," announced. "I'll demand that they stop all non-essential medications immediately." "That's too dangerous," objected. "If you confront them directly, they'll know we have evidence. They might try to eliminate all of us." "My father doesn't have time for us to play it safe," replied firmly. David suggested a compromise. "Let me call the hospital administration and demand an immediate review of Richard's treatment by independent doctors. As his family lawyer, I have the authority to question medical decisions." While David made his calls and continued monitoring the camera feed from Richard's room, at 5 a.m., they witnessed something that made their blood run cold. Victoria entered the room, accompanied by 2 men that recognized as the ones who had tried to break into his apartment. They spoke quietly with Nurse before approaching Richard's bedside. "He needs to be completely unresponsive by the time the board vote takes place," Victoria said clearly, her voice picked up by the hidden camera's microphone. "Increase the dosage to maximum levels. We can't risk him waking up during the transition." One of the men with Victoria handed Nurse a small vial of clear liquid. "Add this to the IV line. It will ensure permanent cognitive impairment." And watched in horror as Nurse prepared to inject the additional drug into Richard's IV system. They were witnessing the final stage of a for individual conscience to overcome him alone. He had an ally who combined her father's principles with her own determination and resources. The question now was whether they could gather evidence and expose the conspiracy before Victoria and her allies realized they were being investigated. Time was running out for Richard, and knew that the next few days would determine whether justice would prevail or whether corruption and greed would claim another victory. Had less than 5 hours to prepare for the conversation that would determine whether a good man lived or died, and whether a corporation built on ethical principles would be transformed into another vehicle for exploitation and greed-en uncertain future, carrying secrets that could save Richard's life or cost his own.